Chapter 1: The Arrival. The Greyhound bus lumbered to a stop at the edge of Ashwood, Montana, its brakes screeching against the cold evening air. Emily Harper glanced out the window, her breath fogging the glass. The town seemed smaller than she'd imagined, a smattering of buildings that could have fit neatly into a postcard. But something about it felt off. The kind of off that prickled at the back of your neck and made the shadows seem darker than they were. She stepped off the bus, her boots crunching against the gravel. A gust of wind blew through the street, carrying with it the mingled scents of damp pine, smoke, and something faintly metallic. She tightened her scarf, shivering against the sudden chill. Ashwood might have looked picturesque, but the air carried a heaviness she couldn't ignore. The bus pulled away, its red taillights fading into the mist. Emily stood there for a moment, alone on the desolate road, the quiet pressing in on her like a physical weight. Across the street, a faded wooden sign swung lazily in the breeze, "Welcome to Ashwood, a town rooted in history." The slogan might have been cheerful if the paint hadn't peeled away to reveal the weathered wood beneath. Emily walked toward the heart of the town, her suitcase rattling over the uneven pavement. Main Street was eerily empty for this time of evening. A single diner glowed faintly at the corner, the flickering neon sign reading Marge's Place. Inside, she could see a handful of locals hunched over their meals, heads down, their movements mechanical. She felt their eyes on her as she passed, the kind of stare reserved for outsiders who didn't belong. Finally, she reached the Hollow Rest, the only inn in town. The two-story building looked like it had been standing for centuries, its wooden frame sagging under the weight of time. The windows were murky, and the shingles on the roof hung on by sheer stubbornness. A weathered sign hung above the door, the paint faded to near illegibility. Emily stepped inside, greeted by the sharp creak of the floorboards. The inn's lobby was dimly lit, the air heavy with the scent of mothballs and mildew. Behind the counter sat an elderly woman with a pale, gaunt face framed by wisps of silver hair. Her hands were clasped on the desk, fingers adorned with tarnished rings. "Evening," the woman said, her voice raspy yet oddly melodic. "You must be Miss Harper." Emily blinked. "How did you?" "Small town," the woman interrupted with a tight-lipped smile. "News travels fast around here. We don't get many visitors, especially not ones asking about, well, you know. Actually, I'm just here to find the truth," the woman cut in, her tone colder now. "Everyone is, at first." She reached beneath the counter and retrieved a key, the brass tarnished and cool to the touch as she placed it in Emily's hand. "Room 3. Top of the stairs. Sleep tight." Emily forced a polite smile and took the key. As she turned to leave, the woman called after her, her voice low and almost conspiratorial. "Stay away from the woods, Miss Harper. Nothing good ever comes from poking around where you don't belong." The warning lingered in Emily's mind as she climbed the creaky staircase. Her room was sparse, with a lumpy bed, a wooden dresser, and a single window overlooking the dark expanse of forest at the town's edge. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in the corners, and the air carried a faint musty odor. She dropped her bag on the bed and pulled out her notebook. The pages were filled with months of research, grainy black and white photos, handwritten testimonies, and newspaper clippings dating back to the 1800s. Each piece connected to the same enigma, the Hollow Man. A shadowy figure said to haunt the town's dense woods, leaving behind nothing but whispers and an ever-growing list of missing persons. Emily ran her fingers over one photograph, a family of 3 smiling in front of their modest home. The caption read, "The Walkers, disappeared, September 1974. The husband's eyes seemed to follow her, as if pleading with her to unravel their mystery. Suddenly, a sharp knock at the door broke her concentration. She froze, her pulse quickening. It was late, too late for visitors. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one. When she opened the door, there was only a folded piece of paper on the floor. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she unfolded it. Written in red ink were 5 chilling words. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. She darted into the hallway, but it was empty, the silence unnerving. Shaking her head, she locked the door and sat back on the bed, the note clenched in her hand. Her gut told her to leave, but her ambition wouldn't let her. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, sleep eluded her. The faint hum of the wind against the window was the only sound, until it wasn't. A voice, low and ragged, barely a whisper, crept through the walls. Don't trust them. Her eyes shot open, heart pounding as she strained to listen. The voice faded as quickly as it came, leaving only the oppressive silence in its wake. Emily lay awake the rest of the night, the unease settling deep into her bones. The woods waited, and so did the truth. Chapter 2, Into the Woods. The sun rose sluggishly over Ashwood, its pale light barely piercing the morning fog that blanketed the town. Emily Harper sipped the bitter coffee she'd picked up from Marge's place, her eyes scanning the edge of the forest that loomed just beyond the inn's window. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Despite the unease that had clung to her since the moment she arrived, Emily couldn't ignore the pull of the woods. Every lead, every story she dug up pointed to this place as the epicenter of the town's dark history. If she wanted answers, she had no choice but to go in. By mid-morning, Emily had gathered her gear, a flashlight, a notepad, a voice recorder, and a map she'd borrowed from the inn's front desk. The elderly woman had been less than enthusiastic about lending it to her. "You don't need that," she'd said, her bony hand clutching the edge of the counter. "Just stay out of the woods, Miss Harper. Nothing good ever comes from there." Ignoring the warning, Emily made her way to the forest's edge. The air seemed to change the moment she stepped onto the dirt path. It was colder here, the light dimmer, as if the trees themselves were swallowing the sun. The sound of her footsteps was muffled, the world around her unnaturally quiet. Her map marked a series of points where the most notable disappearances had occurred. The first was an old hunting cabin, abandoned decades ago but still standing deep within the woods. As she walked, the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots snaking across the path like veins. It wasn't long before she began to feel it, the sensation of being watched. She stopped, her breath visible in the chilly air, and scanned the trees. Nothing moved, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at her nerves. After an hour of walking, she found the cabin. It was a dilapidated structure, its roof sagging under the weight of moss and time. The door hung ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Emily hesitated before stepping inside, her flashlight casting long shadows across the rotting floorboards. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. Cobwebs hung from the corners, and the furniture was little more than piles of splintered wood. On the wall, faded photographs were pinned haphazardly, their edges curling with age. Emily stepped closer, her heart pounding as she examined the images. They were of people, families, couples, children, all smiling, their lives frozen in these haunting snapshots. She recognized some of the faces from her research. They were the missing. Suddenly, a sound broke the oppressive silence, the unmistakable crunch of leaves outside. Emily froze, her pulse quickening. She turned off her flashlight and crouched behind the remnants of a table, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, and heavy, until they stopped just outside the door. She held her breath, her mind racing. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't moving. The silence was unbearable. Then, a shadow passed across the doorway, long and distorted. Emily's grip tightened on the flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if necessary. The shadow lingered for a moment before disappearing. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, she worked up the courage to peer out the window. The forest was still, the path empty. Whoever had been there was gone. Emily exhaled shakily and stood, her legs trembling. She needed to leave, but as she turned toward the door, something caught her eye. In the corner of the cabin, partially obscured by debris, was a trapdoor. Curiosity battled with fear as she approached it. The wood was scratched and stained, the handle rusted but intact. She pulled it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and shone her flashlight down into the darkness. A ladder descended into what appeared to be a cellar. The air that wafted up was damp and cool, carrying a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Against her better judgment, Emily began to climb down. The cellar was small and cramped, the walls lined with shelves of dusty jars. But what drew her attention was the object in the center of the room, a crude wooden table. On it lay a collection of items, a torn piece of fabric, a rusted pocket watch, a child's shoe. Her blood ran cold as she recognized them from her research. These were relics from the missing. A noise behind her made her whip around, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there, but the sense of being watched was stronger now, almost suffocating. She backed toward the ladder, her instincts screaming at her to leave. As she climbed, she felt something brush against her ankle, cold and light, like a finger. She scrambled up the last few rungs and slammed the trapdoor shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally stepped outside, the forest seemed darker than before. The trees loomed closer, their shadows stretching toward her like grasping hands. She ran, the sound of her own footsteps mingling with something else, something faint, like whispers carried on the wind. By the time she reached the edge of the forest, she was drenched in sweat, her hands shaking. She turned back once, her eyes scanning the tree-line. It was empty, but the whispers lingered, echoing in her mind. Don't trust them. Chapter 3, The Whispering Trees. The dawn came reluctantly, the light struggling to break through the dense fog that clung to Ashwood like a shroud. Emily Harper sat in the corner booth of Marge's place, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her notebook lay open on the table, pages covered in scribbled notes and theories that now felt woefully inadequate. The events of the previous day replayed in her mind, the cabin, the trapdoor, the cellar, and that fleeting, icy touch against her ankle. The whispers from the night before lingered in her thoughts. It wasn't just the words that haunted her but the tone, an amalgamation of fear, desperation, and something far darker. As she stared at her notes, she couldn't help but feel as though she was being drawn deeper into a web she didn't fully understand. The diner was quiet, save for the occasional clink of plates and the low hum of the radio in the corner. The handful of patrons avoided her gaze, their conversations hushed as though speaking her name aloud might summon something unwanted. Even Marge, the stout and usually boisterous owner, seemed subdued, her eyes darting nervously toward the window every few minutes. Emily glanced outside. The forest loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette an ever-present reminder of where she needed to go. She finished her coffee and packed her things, steeling herself for the journey ahead. By the time she reached the forest's edge, the sun was high, though its light did little to penetrate the canopy of gnarled branches. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her flashlight and recorder tucked securely inside, and stepped onto the dirt path. The air grew colder almost immediately, the temperature dropping with each step she took. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a bird. An hour passed as she ventured deeper into the woods, her path winding through increasingly dense underbrush. The map she'd borrowed from the inn was little help now, The landmarks it described were either long gone or swallowed by the forest's relentless growth. Still, she pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. Eventually, she came across the clearing. The sight of it stopped her in her tracks. In the center stood a tree unlike any she'd seen before. Its bark was blackened and cracked, as though it had been struck by lightning countless times, yet it stood defiantly, its gnarled branches reaching skyward. The ground around its base was bare, devoid of the moss and underbrush that covered the rest of the forest floor. Emily approached cautiously, her eyes drawn to the objects scattered around the tree's base. There were photographs, some faded and yellowed with age, others more recent. Trinkets lay among them, a locket, a pair of glasses, a child's stuffed toy. Handwritten notes were pinned to the bark with rusted nails, their messages cryptic and unsettling. She picked up one of the photographs, her heart sinking as she recognized the face. It was a woman named Linda Parker, who had vanished in 1983. Emily had read about her in the town's archives, one of many who had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions and grief. The whispers began softly at first, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Emily froze, her eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The voices grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony that sent chills racing down her spine. "Go back. It's watching. You shouldn't be here." She stumbled backward, her flashlight flickering as though the forest itself were interfering with the light. The whispers swirled around her, disorienting and oppressive, until one voice rose above the rest, a single, clear message that chilled her to the core. "Leave before it's too late." Emily's hands shook as she dropped the photograph. She turned to run but stopped when she noticed something on the tree's bark. Names. Hundreds of them, carved into the wood in uneven, jagged letters. Some were barely legible, weathered by time, while others were fresh, the sap still seeping from the wounds in the bark. Her breath caught as she scanned the names. Linda Parker. Michael Walker. Hannah Caldwell. The list went on, a grim ledger of the town's missing. But it wasn't until she saw her own name, freshly carved and glistening, that her blood ran cold. Emily Harper. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, the voices filled with anger and fear. The flashlight in her hand died completely, plunging her into darkness. She backed away from the tree, her heart racing as the forest seemed to close in around her. Blindly, she ran. Her feet pounded against the forest floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps as branches clawed at her arms and face. The whispers followed her, relentless and unyielding, urging her to leave yet refusing to let her go. When she finally broke through the tree line, she collapsed onto the gravel road, her knees scraping against the rough surface. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her own labored breathing. She turned back, her eyes searching the edge of the forest. The blackened tree stood silently in the distance, its twisted branches swaying despite the absence of wind. Emily forced herself to her feet and staggered back to the inn. The elderly woman at the desk gave her a knowing look, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice dripping with something that felt almost like mockery. Emily didn't answer. She climbed the stairs to her room, locking the door behind her. For hours, she sat by the window, staring out at the forest. The whispers were gone, but the silence was no comfort. As the night stretched on, Emily realized something that sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through her veins. The whispers weren't gone. They had followed her. They were inside her now, their voices a haunting reminder that some things should never be uncovered. Chapter 4: The Town's Secrets. Emily Harper couldn't sleep. The whispers had faded to an unsettling murmur, but they were still there, lodged in the recesses of her mind like splinters she couldn't remove. She sat by the window of her room at the hollow rest, staring out at the dark silhouette of the forest in the distance. The events of the previous day replayed in her head, the blackened tree, the etched names, her own name carved into the bark. The forest had marked her. By dawn, she made up her mind. The answers she sought weren't just in the woods, they were in Ashwood itself. The town held secrets, buried truths that no one wanted to talk about. But Emily wasn't leaving until she uncovered them. She headed to the diner, hoping the morning crowd would be more forthcoming than the silent stares she'd received the day before. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and the warm smell of frying bacon filled the air. A few locals sat at their usual spots, their heads turning briefly to glance at her before quickly looking away. Marge, the stout owner, greeted her with a tight-lipped smile. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone perfunctory. "Please," Emily replied, sliding into a booth by the window. She set her notebook on the table, flipping to the page where she'd listed the names from the tree. Marge returned with the coffee and stood there for a moment, her gaze lingering on Emily's notebook. "You won't find anything worth digging up in this town," she said quietly. Emily looked up, surprised by the sudden comment. "What do you mean?" Marge sighed and leaned in, lowering her voice. "People come through here now and then, asking questions. They don't stay long. Either they leave, or they don't." Before Emily could press her further, the diner door swung open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a weathered face, his eyes sharp and suspicious. Marge straightened immediately, her expression hardening. "Sheriff Decker," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Emily's pulse quickened. The sheriff. If anyone knew what was really happening in Ashwood, it was him. Decker's eyes swept the room, landing on Emily. He walked over to her booth, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. "Miss Harper," he said, his voice gravelly. "Mind if I join you?" Emily gestured to the seat across from her, trying to mask her nerves. The sheriff sat down, his presence imposing. "You've been asking questions," he said, folding his hands on the table. "That's kind of my job," Emily replied, forcing a smile. Decker didn't return it. Ashwood's a quiet town. People here like to keep to themselves. I suggest you do the same. Is that a warning?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "It's advice," Decker said, his tone firm. "You won't find what you're looking for. And the more you dig, the more trouble you'll find." Emily leaned forward, her frustration bubbling over. "What's happening in this town? Why won't anyone talk about the disappearances? The Hollow Man?" Decker's expression darkened at the mention of the name. "There's no such thing," he said sharply, cutting her off. "Just stories people tell to scare themselves. Don't waste your time chasing shadows." He stood abruptly, adjusting his hat. "Stay out of the woods," he said over his shoulder as he left. Emily watched him go, her mind racing. The sheriff knew more than he was letting on, she was sure of it. And his warning only made her more determined to uncover the truth. Later that day, Emily visited the town library, a small brick building that looked as old as Ashwood itself. The librarian, a frail woman with glasses perched on the tip of her nose, gave her a wary look as she approached the desk. "I'm looking for information about the town's history," Emily said, trying to sound casual. The librarian hesitated before nodding. "Archives are in the back," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily spent hours combing through the dusty records, piecing together fragments of Ashwood's past. The town had been founded in the mid-1800s, its population bolstered by settlers drawn to the promise of fertile land and untouched wilderness. But from the beginning, there were whispers of strange occurrences, people vanishing without a trace, strange lights in the woods, and an ever-present sense of unease. One document caught her eye, an old journal belonging to a man named William Crowley, one of Ashwood's earliest settlers. His entries grew increasingly erratic over time, filled with ramblings about the Hollow Man and the black tree that watches. Emily's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. One passage stood out. "The tree is not of this world. It calls to us, whispers in the night. We are its servants, bound by blood. To defy it is death." A chill ran down her spine. The blackened tree wasn't just a symbol, it was a focal point, a tether between the town and whatever darkness had taken root here. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily gathered her notes and left the library. The streets of Ashwood were eerily quiet, the shadows stretching long and dark in the fading light. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, her every step echoing too loudly in the stillness. Back at the inn, Emily locked herself in her room and spread her findings across the bed. The pieces were beginning to come together, but the picture they painted was more horrifying than she'd imagined. The town wasn't just haunted by its past, it was complicit in it. And Emily was running out of time to uncover the truth. Chapter 5: Beneath the Surface. The night pressed heavily on Ashwood, the darkness seemingly thicker than usual, as if the forest itself had crept closer to the town. Emily Harper sat in her dimly lit room, the air heavy with the musty scent of old wallpaper and dust. Her notes were spread across the bed, each piece of information connecting like strands of a cobweb, all leading back to the blackened tree and the ominous name that loomed over the town, the Hollow Man. The discoveries she'd made in the library refused to leave her mind. The journal entries, the whispered warnings, the sheriff's hostility, all of it pointed to a horrifying truth. The tree wasn't just a symbol of Ashwood's dark history. It was the source, the heart of something ancient and malevolent. Unable to sit idle, Emily decided to confront the one place she hadn't yet dared to explore, the basement of the Hollow Rest. Her instincts told her that the inn, like the town itself, held secrets buried beneath its surface. The old woman at the front desk was absent, her chair empty and creaking slightly as if recently vacated. Emily hesitated, glancing around the dimly lit lobby. The atmosphere felt wrong, the shadows seeming to move in the corners of her vision. She made her way to the door at the end of the hall, the one marked "Staff Only." It was locked, but the hinges looked old and rusted. With a quick glance over her shoulder, Emily found a heavy candlestick on a nearby table and used it to force the door open. The sound of splintering would echo through the empty inn, making her heart race. Behind the door was a narrow staircase that spiraled downward into darkness. The air was cooler here, damp and thick with the scent of mildew. Emily flicked on her flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as she descended. The basement was larger than she'd expected, its stone walls lined with shelves of old tools and forgotten relics. But it was the far corner that drew her attention, a door, heavy and iron-bound, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The carvings were crude but deliberate, the lines etched deep into the wood. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for the handle. It was ice-cold to the touch, sending a chill up her arm. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was unlike anything she'd ever seen. The walls were covered in the same jagged carvings, the symbols pulsating faintly as if alive. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface slick with a dark, viscous substance. Surrounding it were more objects, personal items, photographs, and bones, so many bones. Emily's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat as she took a step closer. The air was suffocating here, thick with a metallic tang that made her dizzy. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered, and the room plunged into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the light, her fingers shaking. When it finally came back on, she froze. The altar was no longer empty. A figure stood behind it, shrouded in shadow. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, two burning orbs of crimson light, pierced through the darkness, locking onto her. "You should not have come here," the figure said, its voice a guttural rasp that reverberated through the room. Emily stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. "What are you?" she managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, the motion unnervingly slow. "I am what they made me," it said. "What they fed." Before Emily could respond, the room seemed to collapse around her. The walls shifted and twisted, the symbols glowing brighter until the light was blinding. She covered her eyes, her ears ringing with a deafening roar. When the light faded, she found herself back in her room at the inn, her notes scattered across the floor. She gasped for breath, her body drenched in sweat. Had it been a hallucination? A nightmare? But as she looked down at her hands, she saw the truth. They were smeared with the same dark substance from the altar. Whatever she had seen, it was real. Emily knew she couldn't stop now. The truth was buried deeper than she'd imagined, but she was determined to unearth it, no matter the cost. The Hollow Man wasn't just a legend. He was real. And he was waiting. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. The town of Ashwood had always been cloaked in secrets, but now, those secrets were suffocatingly close. Emily Harper paced her room, her mind a storm of fragmented clues and unanswered questions. The blackened tree, the whispers, the altar in the basement, all of it pointed to something far darker than she had ever imagined. The Hollow Man wasn't just a legend. He was real, and Ashwood was his domain. Her hands still bore the faint stains from the substance she'd touched in the altar room, its scent lingering on her skin despite repeated scrubbing. It was a grim reminder of what she'd seen, and what was waiting for her. That evening, she made her decision. If she wanted answers, she had to go back to the source. The tree. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily packed her bag, taking only what she needed: her flashlight, a recorder, and a notebook. The air was heavy with the promise of rain as she made her way to the forest's edge. The townspeople watched her from behind closed curtains, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. The forest greeted her like an old predator, its darkness swallowing the last traces of daylight. The path to the clearing was etched into her memory now, each twist and turn bringing her closer to the truth she both feared and craved. When she reached the blackened tree, the air was unnaturally still. The objects at its base had multiplied: more photographs, more trinkets, more bones. The whispers began almost immediately, their voices rising in a haunting chorus. "Why did you come back? You cannot stop him. You are his now." Emily ignored the voices, her focus fixed on the tree. She placed a hand against its bark, the surface cold and rough beneath her fingers. The whispers intensified, and suddenly, the world around her shifted. The forest dissolved, replaced by a void of swirling shadows. Emily stood in the center of it, her breath visible in the frigid air. A figure emerged from the darkness, tall and imposing, its form a mass of smoke and shadow. Its eyes burned like embers, piercing through her. "You seek answers," it said, its voice deep and resonant. "But answers come at a price." Emily's throat was dry, her voice barely audible as she spoke. "What are you? Why are you doing this?" The figure's form shifted, its edges blurring as it stepped closer. "I am what they made me," it said. "Bound to this place by their fear, their greed, their blood. They fed me with their sins, and I grew. Now, I am eternal." Scenes flickered around her, visions of Ashwood's past. She saw settlers cutting down the forest, their axes biting into the blackened tree. She saw rituals performed in secret, blood spilled to appease something they couldn't understand. And she saw the disappearances, the lives taken as payment for their folly. The Hollow Man, she whispered, the name feeling heavy on her tongue. The figure nodded. A name they gave me, a face for their guilt. I am no man. I am the shadow of their deeds, the consequence of their hubris. Emily's mind raced. Why me? Why my name on the tree? The figure's eyes burned brighter. You sought the truth. You broke the silence. And now, you will carry my story. The shadows closed in around her, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Emily felt herself being pulled into the tree, her body weightless and her mind consumed by the voices. When she awoke, she was lying at the edge of the forest, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. Her bag was gone, her notes missing. The only thing she had was her recorder, clutched tightly in her hand. She pressed play, her breath hitching as the tape began to roll. The whispers filled the air, their words clear and haunting. You cannot escape the Hollow Man. Emily left Ashwood that day, her story unfinished but her resolve unbroken. She knew she couldn't stay, but she also knew she couldn't forget. The Hollow Man was real, and his reach extended far beyond the boundaries of that cursed town. And now, his story was hers to tell,